You're listening to episode 112 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness Practice and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness teachers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Lori A. Brotto joins us to speak about better sex through mindfulness, how women can cultivate desire. For those interested, applications are now open for the Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction Program starting in July of 2018. It's online, live, from the convenience of your home and offered on a donation basis. This is the full 8-week program developed by Jon Kabat-Zinn, used as the gold standard for the scientific study of secular mindfulness. And this is the only MBSR online live program that doesn't have an upfront price of hundreds of dollars. At the end of the program, participants simply make the donation they can. To apply, please visit presentmomentmindfulness.com. Also, if you're listening to this podcast and find value and insights from what is shared here, know that this is made available from your generosity and the generosity of others like you. I want to thank those of you who are making monthly donations to keep this podcast going. And if you're not yet, please take a moment, go to presentmomentmindfulness.com and click on Make a Donation. One-time or especially monthly donations show you value this work, which can't happen without you. Thank you for your help, your support, and your kind generosity. Let's do a thought experiment together. Imagine that you are missing your sense of taste and perhaps smell. Many people do have some challenge with one or more senses, either some reduction or perhaps complete absence of it. What might it be like for you to not be able to taste what might be a delicious meal or smell a lovely scent? Does that change your experience with what others enjoy without restriction? Does not having a sense of taste in this thought experiment bring with it other difficulties around how you relate to others, or perhaps your sense of well-being or self-image? What if instead of one of your senses, it was something that may be more intimately connected with your intimate connections through sexuality? And how might mindfulness help with that connection? Lori A. Brotto, PhD, is a clinical psychologist, sex researcher, and Canada Research Chair in Women's Sexual Health. She is a member of various sexuality organizations and an associate editor for Archives of Sexual Behavior. Lori writes a monthly column called Health Advisor for the Globe and Mail and has been featured in the New York Times, Walrus, Chatelaine, Dan Savage's Savage Lovecast, and many other outlets. She lives in Vancouver, British Columbia. Special thanks to Alice Fleerackers for coordinating today's interview. Our guest today is Lori Brotto. Lori, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Very glad to have you joining us today. And I must say, I've really been enjoying going through the book, and I found it has such a wonderful depth of a combination of a few different areas of life. And we'll get into that in a few moments, but I'd like you to start by telling us about your background.
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity. I've long been interested in human behavior and the causes for human difficulty and human suffering. And originally, I started out with an interest in depression specifically. And that took me to volunteering in an animal lab where we looked at animal models of depression as well as animal models of sexual dysfunction. And that entailed looking at the impact of chronic stressors as well as different medications on the animal's sexual behavior. And we did also investigate their brains as well. And I really enjoyed that work for about 6 or 7 years. It allowed me to really cultivate my interest in the scientific method and understanding human behavior and how it relates to the brain. And it was approximately 1998, the year that Viagra was approved for men in the United States, that there was tremendous interest, this sort of watershed moment in finally a medication that was easy, that was effective, that was readily available, that men could take very discreetly to help them deal with their erection concerns, which we know affects about 15% of men worldwide. And prior to Viagra being available, most of the other treatments for men were rather invasive, involving either surgeries or injections or other techniques that were not had all that well uptake. So there was a tremendous positive response to Viagra. Millions of men filled a prescription within the first few weeks of its approval. And it really elicited a conversation, a national and international conversation around the legitimacy of sexual pleasure and sexual function, and the importance of having effective, available treatments to help those men. Now, shortly after Viagra was approved, quite a large landmark study looking at the prevalence of sexual concerns in men and in women was published. And very importantly, what that study found was yes, that rates of sexual difficulties in men were very high, but they were even higher in women. And the study found that about 40% of women reported persistent sexual concerns over the last year. And that combination of seeing this effective medication for men, helping men, and the much higher prevalence of sexual concerns in women really guided me towards starting to investigate, well, what is available for women? And very soon after my investigation, my literature reviews and searches, I discovered that the science was really quite meager. There had been a few small studies showing the effectiveness of psychological skills and techniques. There were no medications approved for women. And more importantly, there were data showing that countless women, in fact, the majority of women with concerns, were not talking to a healthcare provider or seeking assistance or help for their concern. So that combination of events steered me away from the rat lab and towards the human lab. And that was when I began doing research on women with sexual difficulties. Fast forward some years, I then found myself doing a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Washington in Seattle, where I had the really great fortune to work and study together with Dr. Marsha Linehan, who's really one of the premier experts in the domain of understanding borderline personality and parasuicidal behaviors. And she had developed a treatment, really a behavioral skills-based treatment called dialectical behavior therapy. And one of the core components of that treatment was mindfulness. And so I learned to use mindfulness skills to help individuals suffering from intrusive suicidal thoughts. And what I learned was that by tuning in and paying attention and being right there in the moment with the distressing thoughts, with the cravings, with the compulsions to hurt oneself, that there was a lot of safety in the present moment. And it was very soon after that, my introduction to mindfulness, that I began my own personal practice. I began meditating. I began going to meditation groups. I immersed myself in the meditation literature. And then really had this kind of light bulb moment where I thought, wow, what a powerful way of being and experiencing. And at the same time, I was continuing my research with sexual concerns in women. And I thought, I wonder if this is a tool that we can bring to these women who are experiencing either pain with sex or lack of arousal. I was also doing some work with cancer survivors at the time who had, as a result of their chemotherapy and radiation and surgeries, really no genital or sexual feelings at all. And so that was a bit of an experiment that we tried the first time. We taught them how to meditate. I brought them into my office and we breathed together. We paid attention to body sensations together. And that was back in 2002, 2003. And the rest is history, so to speak.
Wonderful. And shortly after that, I think you published your first book. I think it was in 2014.
Mm-hmm.
First book came out. I wonder if you might say just a few words about that, mindfulness in sexual relationship therapy. How is that a little bit different than the new book?
Sure. Since that formative work in 2002, 2003, most of my work has focused on adapting existing mindfulness-based interventions for women of various kinds of sexual difficulties. And we had accumulated quite a bit of compelling data over those 10, 12 years. And what also happened at the same time is I realized that there was a national interest, there was an international interest in learning about these methods. And in fact, there were other clinicians around the world who were similarly using mindfulness-based strategies with their patients with sexual concerns. So that first book, Mindfulness in Sexual and Relationship Therapy, is a co-edited book that I wrote together with Meg John Barker, who's a psychotherapist in London. And we invited papers from clinicians around the world who were already using mindfulness in their clinical practice. And it was an invitation for them to kind of share their story. So that book was really intended more so for a mental health provider or a clinician audience, whereas the current book, Better Sex Through Mindfulness, is really intended for anyone, any lay person or any individual with an interest in sexual response and mindfulness.
I wonder if you might expand a little bit about that intended reader and what kind of demographics they may fit into and how common, how much this may reach more people than one might otherwise think.
Yeah, so the first study that I referenced in 1999 in the Journal of the American Medical Association was largely based on women living in the United States. It was a broad cross-section of women between the ages of 19 and 70, finding that statistic that about 40% of women have a concern in the domain of sexual function. And since that time, there have been at least a dozen similar studies in countries and cultures around the world. And essentially that statistic has been replicated over and over. So we find that when we focus specifically on the area of low desire, which is the most common sexual concern, and this is the individual who will say, I'm not interested in sexual activity, or I have a great reduction in my libido or desire, and it bothers me, and it significantly interferes in my sense of well-being and in my quality of life and in my interpersonal relationships. And very interestingly, despite, I think, some of the stereotypes that sexual concerns are experienced only by older individuals or only by individuals in very long-term relationships or only in individuals who are depressed or have other significant co-occurring medical conditions. That's actually not true. What the research shows us is that sexual difficulties and specifically low desire cuts across ages, demographics, cultures, socioeconomic statuses, religions, cultural beliefs. In my own practice, my clinical practice, I see quite a large volume of very young women who, for a variety of different reasons, some of which pertain to their sense of self or low body image or sense of wanting to be perfect experience quite distressing levels of sexual difficulties. So, specifically to answer your question, the book is really not intended for any one specific reader. It's for that individual, yes, who has difficulties or concerns around desire, is interested in mindfulness, but it's also meant to speak to all of us. And that's because mindfulness as a skill, but also as a way of being, as a way of relating, as a way of interacting with our world is such a wonderful way of being. And so my hope, despite the title being, the subtitle being how women can cultivate desire, is that really anyone can pick up the book and find some interest or some value in it.
And interestingly, as I was looking through the book myself, I happened upon, and for those of you who already have the book on page 133, is a mindfulness of thoughts exercise. And as I was going through that, it was very much the kind of guidance we might find in any kind of mindfulness-based intervention. So this is very much a mindfulness book too, as that was excellent guidance. And I'm wondering if there was an intention to introduce readers to mindfulness who may have very little experience with it.
Yes, thank you for picking that up. That was absolutely very intentional. And in our work over the years of running mindfulness based groups with women with sexual concerns or women with genital pain, we very much introduce mindfulness as a practice, as something that we hope that the women will take on regardless of the sexual concerns that may have brought them through our door. And in fact, it's a bit of a paradox for the women because one of the first messages that we present to them is we know you're here because of an unhappiness or a distress because of your sexual difficulty, and you want things to change and you want things to be different. But what we're going to do in this group is we're going to stay right here. we're actually going to be right where we are. We're not going to change things. We're going to observe, we're going to experience, we're going to feel. And so it is a bit paradoxical for the women. And then, of course, they start to experience change and, a sense of improved sexual function. But certainly the first several weeks of our groups looks a lot like existing mindfulness-based stress reduction programs with permission from the developers of MBSR as well as mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. We've taken some of those core exercises as a way of introducing the women to mindfulness. And then it's only after women feel like they have incorporated this practice into their life that we then say, all right, now we're going to start to consider how we might apply this or incorporate it into progressively more sexual aspects of your own personal experience.
Yeah, you notice that you spend nearly 30 pages on one of my favorites, the raisin exercise in the book. And it's interesting hearing you say about this against the stream. What seems a little off to people starting the program is we understand you're here in order to elicit some change because there's a problem. There's some difficulty that you're experiencing. And we're not going to do that. We're going to start by simply leaning into what's here now, which is very much in keeping with MBSR and MBCT and other mindfulness-based interventions. And I think that your subtitle on cultivating, that is a wonderful natural outcropping of doing that initial foundational work, that you don't need to, from day one, start to go into changing because you're planting the seeds. Mm-hmm. That's a natural result. It sounds like that's what you see in your programs and you have. What are some other ways in which you have found mindfulness practices as helping with some of the difficulties that women are encountering?
Yeah, I love that reference to planting the seeds. And I feel like that's very much how we as the facilitators guide the groups. At no point during our groups do we try and sell mindfulness. So we don't throughout the group say, you need to practice mindfulness because it will improve your sexual function or desire in this way. Rather, what we do is we do the practice. We do the meditations together. And then following the meditation, we continue with an in-depth inquiry where a facilitator may ask the women about her experience. What did you notice? What came up for you? How is this different from how you might eat a raisin in your life in general? And then the third question that we ask, really in my mind, the pivotal question is, how is, in the case of the raisin exercise, how is eating the raisin in this way relevant, if at all, to your sexuality? And the women have the answers. We don't tell them, they have the answers. Suddenly, it's as if, the veil has been lifted and they say, wow, if I can notice the exquisite sensations from a single raisin in just 10 minutes and experience what that feels like to notice my mind drift, which it inevitably does for all of us, sometimes countless times, and have a sense of ability to guide it back when it takes off. Imagine if I could apply those same skills to sexuality. So they have the answers. We simply provide the vehicle and the venue and the safety and the permission to do the practices together. And then with some gentle guidance and nurturance around what was that like? How is that different? How is this relevant? They're immediately able to see how these skills in present moment, non-judgmental mindfulness are really relevant to their sex life and their life in general.
That's one of the fascinating things about teaching programs like MBSR is that you don't really need to give the answers. In fact, you don't want to give the answers because they already have the answers. Yeah. And it's just a wonderful experience when I teach and seeing that opening up and that awareness of, oh, it's already in me. I'm wondering, what is this like for you personally when you see these openings and these shifts in the participants? What's that like for you?
So I often get asked whether I have my own mindfulness practice. And I do. It's a practice, it's a way of being that I also have experienced tremendous insight and appreciation and benefit from. And I really take that way of being with me when I'm interacting with the women. And it's incredibly powerful to hear and to see before your very eyes stories of women who've had repeated experiences of disappointment or suffering or rejection or negative self-doubt suddenly feel empowered to experience their sexuality maybe for the very first time in a totally different way. And it affects me powerfully in the moment, to see their faces, to hear their descriptions, to witness their tears. And of course, I react, and there's often tears in my own face as well as a response to that. And again, it's regardless of the women's own personal stories or ages or demographics. We've had many women in our groups who have not been sexually active for many years or even many decades for fear of pain or fear of rejection or other reasons, maybe a history of sexual assaults or other adverse events. And they suddenly feel like, wow, this is something I can cultivate. This isn't something that is left purely to chance, or it's not something that's just a reflex in my body or in my brain that when that timer ticks off, the moment's gone. But rather, this is something that with some deliberate presence and intention, I can experience and feel for the first time.
Wonderful. So you've already made some really good statements around this. In the book, you use some wonderful examples, and anonymously, of course, of women who have been helped by mindfulness practice. And I'm wondering, what are some of the reasons that you find mindfulness so very powerful in helping with these shifts for women who are experiencing sexual difficulty?
So, as you know, Ted, I'm a researcher as well as a clinician, and so from a research perspective, this has been one of the questions that's been consuming my own thoughts for the last at least 5 years, which is, how does this work? What exactly are we doing? And so, through our research methods and attempting to ask questions in a very precise way, as well as we have a number of different psychophysiological measurements looking at responses in the body, responses to our ability to kind of tune into our body, that interoceptive awareness. It's allowed us to start to answer that question in a very kind of primitive way. We still have a long way to go to fully understanding. But one of the things we've detected in our research is that first and foremost, we're eliminating distraction. We live in a culture, in a society where we are bombarded with distractions, and we're pulled in a multitude of directions, and we often hear the kind of praise of multitasking, as if multitasking is something we want to be, some coveted state. And yet there's an enormous body of research showing us the costs associated with multitasking on a number of fronts.
And the misinterpretation that multitasking is actually how the human brain works when it doesn't.
That's right. That's right. And so I think that's one of the things that we're doing is we're allowing individuals to really remain present and rooted in sensations. One of the things we know about sexual response is that it really requires this kind of feedback loop from the brain tuning into the body, noticing maybe initial signs of arousal. And those messages then get fed back into the brain, which then starts this really nice positive feedback loop. And yet there's a multitude of things that can interrupt that feedback loop, like distractions, like negative self-judgment, like medications perhaps that might get in the way of that feedback loop and that signaling. So we are allowing, where we're really helping these women to tune in, and in turn, they are able to notice subtle changes in sensation, in arousal, in pleasure, in excitement that they otherwise are not noticing. One of the other things that has arisen in our research is that individuals with sexual concerns are often plagued with intrusive thoughts about poor performance. So I won't respond. My partner will notice I'm not responding. My partner will leave me. I'll never have sex again. These really catastrophic thoughts about the outcome of sexual encounters. There's been quite a lot of research showing that that's very, very common, and that can be a significant contributor to sexual difficulties. And so because we're practicing mindfulness compassionately and with boatloads of kindness towards ourselves, we've observed in the research that that negative self-judgment has gone down quite a bit. There's probably effects also on mood and on anxiety. Both sadness and depression and anxiety often co-occur with sexual desire concerns, and our research has found that as a result of the practice in our groups, that both symptoms of depression and anxiety begin to lessen, and those effects continue for up to a year after that we follow women. And then we're also interested in some of the more body-related physiological changes. So we have different measures of physical sexual response that women will take part in. We are tracking eye tracking patterns as a way of paying attention to kind of neural correlates that happen. And of course, we know that mindfulness, being a brain method, changes our brains. It changes how our brains function, and it changes also the structure of our brain. So we have some kind of preliminary ways of looking at exactly what happens in the brain as a result of practice. And then finally, one of the other domains specifically is around stress. Stress is at epidemic levels in our culture, in our society today. Stress can also be a major contributor to sexual difficulties. And so in addition to self-report questionnaire measures of stress, we also measure the body's stress response. So we look at the outpouring of cortisol in the morning and in the evening, and look at how well the body kind of regulates the stress response before they begin their mindfulness program and then afterwards. So long answer, complicated answer. We're still quite a ways out, but the short answer is that there's probably a large variety of different ways that leads to mindfulness being useful for sexuality.
Yeah, this is also a good segue for us to talk a little bit about the science. And I'm wondering if you have any studies, either your own or perhaps the research of others, that you found particularly interesting or insightful about how mindfulness may be working with sexuality.
Yeah, so one of the groups that I work quite closely with, so I'm a psychologist in a university department of gynecology and often work with women who are experiencing chronic genital pain. And one of the things we know about chronic genital pain, like other chronic pain conditions, is that the kind of maintenance of their pain is as a result of changes in brain function that are maintaining the pain. So these most unfortunate women, when they see doctors or gynecologists, they're often looking for the source of their pain in their genitals. And there's no sign of infection, there's no cut, there's no trauma. And mindfulness as essentially a way of changing the brain or enhancing certain aspects of brain function is a perfect vehicle for allowing these women with chronic genital pain to experience their sensations in a different way. So I'm fascinated by some of the neuroimaging science that looks at how does mindfulness change the brain? And one of the things we know now that we didn't know 50 years ago is that the brain is very plastic. The brain continues to change well into the elder years, and mindfulness can be a powerful way of cultivating neurogenesis, the development of new neurons, projections into new parts of the brain, and importantly, for weakening some of the connections in the brain that can be problematic. So, what I mean by that is specifically in the area of chronic pain, for someone who experiences ongoing and debilitating and distressing pain, when they have the pain, you sort of see the whole brain light up. You have the thinking centers in the brain where the person has really negative and catastrophic thoughts about the pain never going away and how they'll never be able to cope. You have lighting up of the emotion center of the brain, the amygdala, the motivation center, the frontal cortex, which controls what we decide to do. And what it means is that for individuals with chronic pain, that they're mobilized to act in this fight or flight kind of way. And what mindfulness does is scientists have coined this term decoupling, which means that by focusing on just the sensations, let's not even call it pain. Let's focus on what it feels like. Is it a vibration? Is it a temperature? Is it a pressure? Where is it? That you see this quieting down of those other centers that really need not be firing in the moment. And the result of that is that the individual, yes, continues to experience the sensations of the pain, but they don't have the co occurring catastrophic thoughts, sadness, anxiety that goes along with it. And so that body of science, those brilliant neuroscientists that are helping us understand where in the brain mindfulness works, I think can apply a lot to a variety of different populations, but specifically these women with chronic genital pain as well.
Laurie, I'm wondering if there's anything else that you'd like to share with the listeners, maybe if you have any thoughts about the value of mindfulness as it becomes more mainstream, or anything else you'd like to share.
Well, that's a very open ended question. I'll choose just a couple. One question that I have been asked is why just a book for women? And it's a really valid question. And, women is included in the title, How Women Can Cultivate Desire. Although if you dive into the book, I talk about men as well. And increasingly in our research, we've now carried out a few studies applying mindfulness strategies for men because we know that low desire in men is also quite common. About 20% of men experience low desire. And these, again, are men across ages, not necessarily men with medical conditions or low testosterone, but men also face major societal expectations of being hyper masculine or how they should be and having expectations of a certain body image, etc., all of which can impact their sexuality and their sexual desire and sexual response. So the stories that are told, the skills that are presented, the recommendations that are made throughout the book for women, I believe apply very, very well with men as well. So that's one thing I wanted to mention. I think another point that is really important is maybe just a bit of a caveat that this isn't intended to be a self-help book. It's not the case someone picks up the book, reads through it start to finish, and suddenly they're a mindfulness expert and they have fantastic sexual pleasure and sexual response. The hope is that this is an invitation for the individual to become curious about mindfulness, hopefully journey them down a path towards continuing to practice and incorporate mindfulness into their life. And I do feel somewhat strongly about the importance of the formal practice, the what I call on the pillow practice, in the same way that going to a gym is really important for encouraging muscle growth, etc., that will then allow you in your day-to-day life to pick the book off the shelf and reach over and pick something up without getting hurt. So with mindfulness, it's important that we have that formal practice and that we kind of incorporate it within our day-to-day life when we're standing in line at the grocery store, when we're having a conversation with people, when we're eating a meal, or when we're having sex.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. And you've mentioned it several times in here. Mindfulness is not so much a technique, something you bring out of a bag of tricks now and then, but a way of being.
Mm-hmm.
It's really integrating that exercise time. Again, we use the exercise metaphor a lot in this podcast of your on the cushion time to out in the world. It's not about the cushion. It's about everything else too.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you.
Our guest today, Lori Brotto. Lori, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much, Ted. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.